So this session online, I'm kind of going to put training in quotes because I'm not sure that there is an expert or someone who's really qualified to train Episcopal and mainline church planters and what it means to be sustainable. We're kind of figuring that out together at the moment. It was interesting. I was on a call with Mary Alice earlier this morning with her bishop and talking about how this moment of worldwide crisis is actually testing sustainability, not of new missional places, not of church plants, but of long established churches who are going to be finding out how many of their parishioners actually come to church because they want to, and who's going to be using this as a good reason to, if they can't come for the next 6 months, to kind of, taper off completely. And so sustainability, right, being something that involves not just finances and how we support and fund our churches, but also what are the marks of a sustainable community that thrives and is resilient even in the face of some crisis. Just to kind of introduce you to this, and then I'm going to introduce Danielle. I was just looking at some of the statistics from our new Episcopal Church communities from the last 6 or 7 years. And then in my other hand, I had some of the statistics from worshiping communities that were started through the Presbyterian Church over the last 9 or 10 years. And they're, both denominations are pretty much looking like that there are being planted some traditional congregations, usually often suburban, that are attracting over 100 people on a Sunday and are well on their way to being financially self-sustaining, and defining that, right, of course, as having a building and having a full-time pastor and a lot of the trimmings and trappings of what we expect from those kind of traditional churches. But then the majority of our church plants in the Episcopal Church and the majority in the PCUSA are led by bivocational people or even lay leaders, and are gathering between 20 and I'd say maybe 60 on the generous end numbers of people, which kind of says something about how people are gathering, I think, in the 21st century, what they're longing for and what they need from the church. A greater degree of intimacy, perhaps. But what it's also doing is making this question of sustainability even more pertinent and something that we're needing to begin to redefine, I think, for our time. So what Danielle and I have talked about doing is he's going to take about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to take probably not even quite as long to tell you some stories about St. Gabriel's in Virginia and then the Abbey in Birmingham. And what I urge you to do is just kind of listen for some of those points that maybe connect with your story, and then we'll open it up for some more conversation about what this means to be sustainable. So Danielle, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, please, and thank you. And thank you everyone for being present on the call. Before I go into St. Gabriel's, I just want to take a step back to my last congregation, because one of the most important things that all of you have already know from being in any of these conversations is that there is no cookbook. There is no one way of doing any of this. As planters or redevelopers, you know, my model will not fit into yours. And one of the great things of having these conversations is there will be a nugget of anyone's story that you can either incorporate or relate to or remember, that it's an opportunity, a possibility in your ministry. So there's no cookbook for sustainability. There's no cookbook for ministry. There's just no cookbook. But we do have, you know, there could be just chapters in an empty book. And I think the chapters, the titles, is sort of what we're talking about today when we think about sort of the characteristics of a community in this frame of sustainability. How are we, you know, labeled durable? How can we be resilient? And the first thing that came to mind, of course, is our people. Um, and the second thing that came to mind was how the Holy Spirit operates with us and the people. So I wanted to take a step backward because in my last ministry, I've been ordained 14 years now. I came into the ministry as a church planter to start a Latino ministry in Salem, Massachusetts. And I did not have I was not given a church. I didn't inherit a church. I was ordained having been an engineer in high technology in startup companies. So I think my bishop trusted that my startup background in technology and in the business world was something that would be helpful in starting new worship communities. And because I'm Puerto Rican, I'm bilingual. Uh, that diocese and I personally knew that it was important to start Spanish language worship. There were a few congregations already, but you know, Massachusetts at that point was the largest diocese in the United States and only had 4 Latino ministries out of about 198 congregations, and that's pretty pathetic. And but that's the model in most dioceses. I'm in the Diocese of Virginia, where there are 186 congregations, and there are 5 Latino ministries. So I say it's pathetic because the Latino population, as most of you know, is the fastest growing demographic in the United States. But the Episcopal Church, along with other denominations, are way behind the 8 ball. That said, we're here. And so, you know, we're doing the best we can with what we have. Why did I want to start with St. Peter San Pedro is because I went to Salem, Massachusetts as a guest for 3 years in an English language congregation that said, sure, you could use us as a starting point where you could start this congregation. If it works after 3 years, you have a community of faith, but you can't stay here. So the way it worked at St. Peter San Pedro, at that point it was Iglesia de Gracia, it was Grace Church, was the bishop or the diocese paid for my salary. So if we're talking financial sustainability and not necessarily the people sustainability, the leadership development, but really the financial sustainability, I knew that I could count on a salary. I was a full-time clergy, and he said, no, we're going to pay for your salary. Do whatever you can. And he didn't give me a time frame for ending the holy experiment. All the rest of the funds I needed to raise on my own, but I had a building to operate from. So that was really helpful. I didn't have a parish administrator, although there was a parish administrator in that office. So it was, you know, a one-person gig. But what I decided to do is not start worship for the first year and a half. For the first year and a half, in the amazing gift from heaven of my best friend who retired the year before I was ordained, a Latina who is an educator. She was a professor at Boston University teaching Spanish, and today is a deacon. No surprise there because she was doing diaconal work with me. So she was my co-planter in charge. She was my right hand, left hand. Her name is Emma Rosero, and Emma was the yin to the yang. So I always believe that you need to have, you can have a male clergy, there should be a female, either clergy or layperson, to do the planting work together. Usually in other contexts, it is a layperson, part of your team, someone who you know is that person. So Emma was that right hand, left hand person for me. And what we did was volunteer in the community, get to know the community and be known by it. When the community asked us, you know, ¿cuándo van a empezar a adorar a Dios? ¿Cuándo van a tener misa? When are you going to start doing worship? He said, oh, you want worship? Oh, cool, we could do that. We had a place at Grace Church to do worship, and we did it. So how did I make that a financially sustainable community of faith worshiping? Well, it wasn't sustainable in the dictionary definition because you know, the diocese paid $50,000 from my salary plus benefits. So from that perspective, we weren't sustainable. But I learned when I was in seminary how to write grants, which also isn't the textbook definition of sustainability. But for the first 8 years at St. Peter San Pedro, a congregation that continues to exist, all of my programmatic budget was achieved through grant writing. And what did I write grants for? I wrote grants for youth ministry. I wrote grants for music ministry. I wrote grants for women's ministry, and I wrote grants for social justice ministry, and we qualified that social justice ministry as our healthy eating programs and diapers. We had a diaper ministry. So it was what was most important to, from the community organizers in this group perspective, what the people needed and what the people requested. And we had a year and a half to sort of figure that out as people that weren't worshiping. I didn't have the challenge of having to schedule how to do, you know, to do worship in that process. And that was really helpful for me then. So I came to Virginia now 8 years ago to an English language congregation, an English speaking members of the community. It was a church plant that what preceded me, planted in 2002. We do not have a building. I think someone else on this, Lanny, said that earlier. It's a church without a building. As a matter of fact, in the next 3 months, we are getting a gift of 12 acres of land. How wonderful is that? Some people are already lamenting the fact that this church that has been nomadic for so long is going to become like the rest of the churches where there'll be, you know, it's be an institution. And one of the prayers and dreams that I have is because we're so outward looking, that our congregation will always remain sort of smaller in numbers and just multiple services like the Roman Catholics do. I mean, you hit 150 people, you want it to feel comfortable, family-ish like, oh, you hit 100 people and do another service, you know, an hour and a half later, and people can choose the family they want to be part of. And we're sort of hitting that at St. Gabriel San Gabriel. So when I came here, it was St. Gabriel's. We had 20 people, down from about 150 because unfortunately, when the planter left, the diocese didn't put another priest into this mission church for 4 years. Not good. So the cookbook, again, right in your cookbook at the top, don't leave a baby abandoned, right? That makes sense to us, but it doesn't make sense to some of diocesan leaders that don't understand how we do what we do. And I was hired into this community, not wanting to come to this part of, not even wanting to come to Virginia, but the Holy Spirit had another plan. It is my dream job because I wanted to come into a church that had already been planted by someone else and redevelop it into something new. And how was St. Gabriel's redeveloped? Well, the congregation hired me because they wanted to become bilingual, but they didn't know what that meant. And they knew that I had that experience. So when I was hired, I did absolutely nothing with Latino ministries for the first 3.5 years. And then I started to explore. It was the New Episcopal Community Grant that sort of was what pushed my bishop to push me to start the Spanish language service. Everything that I counsel people not to do is what I did here at St. Gabriel San Gabriel. I was really having, from certain circumstances and situations that my predecessor left here at St. Gabriel's, I had to do about 3 years of just caregiving, pastoral support. There was a lot of distrust in the clergy. My immediate predecessor, not the person who planted the church, was here for 10 months and did a lot of damage. About 80 people left in those 10 months of that person's tenure. And so I had to help people lick the wounds and be present. There was no room to invite new anything at all. And also had to grow these 20 people that were, I call them the stickers. They really stuck it out at St. Gabriel's come hell or high water. And so nourish them, pastor them. I called everyone in the database. There were about 300 names, and just figured out with them why they left. I told them that I wasn't calling them to invite them back to St. Gabriel's, but I wanted to know what had happened, and if they would inform me why, why they think things happened and what they would suggest I do moving forward. They knew that I was hoping to start a Latino ministry, but I told them that I didn't know when, and that it would not be a bilingual congregation where everything was going to be English, Spanish at the same time. One thing I knew about the demographic of Latinos here is that the demographic of Latinos here is what I call off the boat immigrants. Really, really recently migrated, about 90% undocumented, something that I had never experienced before in Latino ministries. So we had to, figure ourselves and each other out. None of our Latino members were Episcopalian. As a matter of fact, most of our English-speaking members weren't either. So one of the things that I'd like to talk to you about from a financial sustainability perspective is, how is it that St. Gabriel's can be considered sustainable with the varying definitions of sustainability, and where do I envision, or how do I envision it going to the cookbook definition of sustainability, which is autosufficiency. I will start by saying that when I came to this community, the mother church of St. Gabriel's, that would be the church that hosted this mission into being, and by that I mean they sustained it financially and now sustain it with in-kind contributions. St. James Church here in Leesburg has given St. Gabriel's probably $800 to $1,000 to $1 million in the years that it's been alive. Presently, they don't give us cash, but the office that I'm sitting in right now is free. And in Leesburg, this 10 by 20 foot office probably costs $2,000 a month to rent. They do that for free. Plus, my Spanish language service takes place in their sanctuary, so I don't have to rent a space to have that service at 3 o'clock. My English language service takes place in a school cafeteria, and we pay about we'll probably be paying this year $27,000 a year to rent a school cafeteria for 3 hours on a Sunday. That's pretty expensive. But we are in the richest county in the United States, Loudoun County, and it is the fastest growing county in the United States. Although it's the fastest growing county in the United States, we're sort of a bedroom community of Washington, D.C., so the authentic inclusivity nature of our congregation is not unique. And every single church denomination, Christian or non-Christian, you can think of can be accessed in the English language within a 15 to 20 mile radius from where we are. So there's a lot of competition with English speakers. There's not hardly any competition with Spanish speakers. There's one large Roman Catholic church, which is a stone's throw from my office here. And there are about 9 Pentecostal evangelical churches in our community. And St. Gabriel's is quite different than all of those, because when I say we're authentically inclusive, that means we do not, there are no barriers to accessing God or Jesus Christ in any way. No matter what your marital status is, your sexual identity, your developmental disability or not, or ability, I should say, we are authentically inclusive at St. Gabriel's. That is not the case in the majority churches in Leesburg, other than my beloved friends that are Unitarian Universalists, but they don't tend to have any Latino followers because it's just a different way of doing church and a different understanding and belief. So St. James was the first funder. The Diocese of Virginia always gave the congregation about maybe 5% of its budget. There was always congregational stewardship. And I would tell you that the average pledge in this congregation is probably higher than many places in the US. So the average pledge is about $3,800 per pledger. I came from the Diocese of Massachusetts where the average pledge was about $400 per pledger. The region that we're in, so we have a strong regional presence. There are about 18 or 19 churches in this region called the Northern Piedmont region. And grant writing are the sources of funding for St. Gabriel's. And I'll describe those to you because maybe there's going to be a nugget that you can benefit from this conversation. St. James was the mother church. Not everyone has a mother church that will support their ministry. So check it if it's important, and if it works, and if it doesn't, skip to the next one. The diocesan support. When St. James stopped supporting us financially, and they had an agreement with me that for the first 3 years of my tenure here, they were going to do a step down contribution, starting with $75,000, $59,000, $28,000, and they were true to that. Come end of year 3, it stopped, but they continued to give us in kind, the use of my office, and then a year and a half later, we started the Spanish language services here. So I went to the diocese and I said, you've given us $18,000 or $20,000 in the last 10 years. St. James has gone away. Belly up to the bar. How are you gonna support this congregation that is your mission? You called me into this diocese to not only support the English language ministry that we have, but start a Latino ministry. What are you gonna do to support us financially? And thanks be to God, they stepped in. Within a year, they went from $18,000 annually to $50,000, and presently they've given St. Gabriel's $75,000 annually for the last, I think, 3 or 4 years. So they've gradually increased their giving to St. Gabriel's. I'm going to pause here for people who don't have church buildings, because one of the challenges that I know I will soon have is when we decide to construct a building, it is not financially feasible to get a loan from a banking institution when you are not, quote unquote, self-sustainable. And the money from the diocese is not included as a source of revenue that we can count on in the eyes of the bank. So it would be detrimental for a church loan, for us to go to a bank institution, for example, to get a loan for the church building that we're gonna at some point build. So that's a parenthesis for those who are in the building mode, in the physical building mode. To be honest with you, I'm relying on the Holy Spirit. I believe that with God, all things are possible. And there's a way that we may not even have to rely on a bank to get the costs covered. And I am not a naive person. I've been in business I was in the business world for over 20 years before I was a priest. I just have this spiritual feeling that I've had before I came to St. Gabriel's, that this was going to be possible because God wants it to be, or else I wouldn't be here. That said, maybe God's plan is for us to get sources from other mechanisms, and I don't know what that is going to be. So when we talk about sustainability with the building, it's a ball game that I haven't even considered. I'm not part of that ball game. Regional stewardship. Our regional churches pay a sort of a tithe for mission work, and they have consistently given St. Gabriel's between $2,000 and $10,000 a year since its inception. That is an ethos, and maybe you could help create that ethos in your community, because these 19 churches, even if all they put in is $500, $200, $50 a year, they're committed as people with mission focus to support either ministries. It could be a youth ministry, a mission trip, or the mission churches in the region with some financial contribution. And we've relied on that. I just got an $1,800 grant from them to send 12 of our kids to Reach Camp. They can't afford the $400 subscription to go, but they're going. And again, with God, all things are possible. And the last thing on my list was grant writing. I learned to write a grant in seminary, and it has been the lifesaver of my ministry. I must have received in my, let me see if this is accurate. So in my 14 years of ministry, I have received probably over $600,000 or $700,000 in grants, and that's a lot of money. And that grants that have not only come from the Episcopal Church. I've gotten grants from the local police department. I've gotten grants from the Diabetes Foundation for healthy eating programs. I've gotten grants from individuals that have family foundations that requires networking. Here in Virginia, when I came here, I joined the Rotary Club, and I have never been a club member. I don't like being clubby, and I was recommended, these are the movers and shakers, but they're really people that you should get to know. And it has been a blessing because although they're probably in a different political or religious spectrum, so West and Northern Virginia is very conservative, very, very conservative politically and religiously. So we're the liberal, funky church that where all are welcome. But I have gotten so much support from Rotarians who are on really the different, completely opposite spectrum politically than I am, and even religiously, but they believe in what we're doing. And one of the things that they believe that we are doing and subscribe to is that even if they don't accept undocumented immigrants in their political, brain, they do understand that, we are one body in Christ, and we're doing justice work. I keep on saying to them, our ESL programs, our literacy programs for children to learn Spanish, STEM classes for immigrants, those are justice issues. Our immigration programs to get, attorneys to represent people that are undocumented, that's a justice issue. So for reasons that I'm not quite sure, maybe that's the Holy Spirit's business and not mine, I've gotten a lot of financial support from folks. Sometimes I don't even have to ask. And they say, how are things at St. Gabriel's? Do we need to help you somehow? And usually what they mean by that is with money. And I am okay with that. I am okay with that. So the sustainability piece in St. Gabriel's and in my past ministry has always been about being creative. Someone once said that if there is a quarter under a rock, Daniel would find it. I don't think it was said in the nicest way. And to be honest with you, I don't really care, because my motto as a church planter and congregational redeveloper has always been, it is out there. There's a lot of resources out there. We have to be as creative in doing our ministries as we are in finding the money to sustain them. The money is out there. There are a lot of people that want to support the kind of ministries that we do. And I can say that my ministries in Massachusetts and here in Virginia have been really, really different. And they've flourished. They've continued to happen. And yeah, I put a lot of work into it. And it's not a solo thing. I've always had a huge amount of, supporters at different levels in the ring. If you're going to look at it as the solar system, there's the ones that are at the center, and then there are the planets that are around it. And so it's worked by God's grace, and a lot of work. But creative thinking has been a part of it. And this kind of network that we're doing right now has always been really helpful, because you never know when you're going to get a nugget from someone. And you do know that you could always call someone back to get some information. I've always given my grants, copies of my grants that I've given, to anyone that asks. If, my old NEC grants, I can give you a copy. My, most recent grant to the police, I could give you a copy. You always have to adapt it anyway. It's not like you're copying someone's test to give to someone else. You have to adapt it to your own needs. But I learned in my writing grants how to just be systematic, and I've learned how to answer the questions, which is the basics and fundamental of grant writing. And you will never, the only way you can learn how to write a grant is writing one.
Danielle,
And
that's awesome. For
thank
the
you.
sake of time, can I ask if in, I was going to ask for questions or responses at the end, but I wonder if there are any sort of like responses or thoughts that Danielle and his story raised for you before I tell you a
So,
different story.
hey, Katie.
Yeah.
Um, in my previous life, I was a grant reader. I worked for 2 foundations as the person who read the grants that people wrote, and I would concur. You don't learn until you actually start writing. And the other thing about writing is don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call the gatekeepers, call the readers of the grants, because they will save you so much time. If you're sitting there going, oh, do they want this? Do they want that? Pick up the phone and call them and they'll tell you, because they want the most precise thing. And quite often they'll give you information that you might not otherwise have to help craft a much clearer grant. They want you to be successful too. It's not like they're Uncle Scrooge. So that's what I would add about grant writing.
And what I would add to what you said, Bobby, and thank you for that, is that every grant I write, even if it's a 1-pager, because there are a lot of those 1-pager grants for a couple thousand bucks, believe it or not, and a couple $1,000 could be your youth ministry for the year. Hello, so I've written many of those. Is I always give the copy of the whole grant that I'm writing to someone that has nothing to do with what I'm writing about, or even the church. I send it to my atheist friends. I send it to, a cousin in Puerto Rico who just has nothing to do with my ministry, and ask them if here's the question and this is my response. Do you know what I'm doing? Does this make sense to you? And it makes a lot of difference when you have, and I always have at least 2 readers, 2 people that are independent from what I'm doing. Help me. And someone who's a native English speaker. I'm not a native English speaker. I'm not a native English writer. So I always give my grants to people who are the English majors and say, look at my English. Do I make sense? And I think that could be a benefit to native English speakers. And I'm saying this now because I do a lot of translations work for the church, and the English of Harvard types is horrible. And when you translate it is when you see how bad the English is and how much cliche is used. So that breeds lack of clarity. And so I would recommend, if you're using grants as a source of sustainability, and I'm couching grants is not considered a sustainable model for, in the cookbooks of some institutions, but people that are entrepreneurial as we are have to rely on them. On and on and on repetitively, and you make it sustainable to a certain degree.
Danielle, you've got someone in the chat box just asking if you'd mind putting your email address in there.
Sure. I'm going to do that right now. Thank you.
All right, that was awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I want to just to kind of add to our conversation and some of the things that may be in your head as you're discerning a new community or continuing to commit and develop your new Episcopal community, knowing how uncertain things are right now. So I want to offer you a story about my church plant here in Birmingham, the Abbey. Some of you, if you have already received a new Episcopal community grant in this triennium, have been subjected to what we're calling a covenant conversation. And here's the part of the source of the reasoning behind these covenant conversations. If you haven't, it's just an onboard with the bishop, your diocesan CFO, usually me, and the church planter. Part of the source was a pretty significant misunderstanding that I had with my bishop and diocesan leadership before we started the Abbey. The Abbey is, or it was for 4 years, a coffee shop and Episcopal worshiping community. And because there was not a lot of clarity in our conversation up front, among the key players being me, our diocesan bishop, and the rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which was a primary funder of my salary at the beginning of the church plant. I had an idea going into this scenario that the Abbey, being a coffee shop, was primarily an act and a work of evangelism for the diocese. It's planted in an area that doesn't already have an Episcopal church, where there's a lot of younger people, both professionals, but also kind of like failure to launch younger people, a very diverse urban neighborhood. And because of the kind of the novelty of doing evangelism and ministry that way, I think I just assumed that I was going to be kind of like one of the staff missioners in the bishop's office, and that I would be taken care of. So for the first couple of years, I was technically on the staff of St. Luke's. They were paying me a salary. It started off as a half-time salary, and then it became a full-time salary to plant this church. We launched the coffee shop. It went fairly well. It did what it needed to do. It evangelized, it engaged a lot of people in spiritual and religious conversation and worship that might not have darkened the doors of a traditional parish. And then there came a moment when I needed to part ways with St. Luke's, which was that primary funder. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. I think, honestly, I think primarily the Abbey was functioning in such a different context than St. Luke's, which is a white suburban neighborhood, very, very affluent, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country. And that there was just a discrepancy. They couldn't wrap their heads around the kind of ministry that we were doing, especially when the Abbey started to reach out more and more to the folks in rehab and on the street and in the projects that are, not even a quarter mile away. And when we parted ways and we really just couldn't work out that letter of agreement, we tried a whole lot of times, and probably some of the responsibility for that came from both parties. I found myself for about 18 months making my salary, because I not only was the priest at the coffee shop for those 18 months, but also the manager. We had I think I had to fire our first manager, and then we had an interim, and then we parted ways with St. Luke's. And so I ended up stepping into that role, and talk about not sustainable. Not financially sustainable, because financially that actually was sustainable. But as far as my time and my mental health, probably for at least a year, I was working at least a 12-hour day, 5 days a week, but then often there, 6 or 7 days a week, because a coffee shop it's a hard business to run. It's open for a lot of hours. You have to be there when you say you're going to be there. And it was just too much. That really took a toll on my family and on me. So we moved to, just out of necessity, a model where we hired a new business manager. He did a fantastic job. And I moved to first a part-time basis. Our diocese did pay me a little bit of money. And then to a non-stipendiary basis at the beginning of 2019. And something I should have thrown in the front end of that story is that while I had kind of thought of this project as being something that was a work of pure evangelism, our bishop and CFO had the idea that it would eventually become this profitable business that would support the salary of a priest. And, maybe this is just my naivete, but I didn't realize until several years in that they had that assumption. So I think that as you're launching your new community, before you launch your new community, some really strong communication between you and your diocesan leaders and any sponsoring parishes is just absolutely necessary. Make sure you know how long your salary will be supported, and at what level, and what you need to do in order to, if they make you like reapply for funding year after year, what is it, Bishop, that you need to see? What are the numbers that you need to see? What are the stories you need to hear in order to feel comfortable supporting me next year? It's just a point that I harp on again and again and again. So we moved into that model beginning of 2019, where we had a paid coffee shop manager and me, a non-stipendiary priest. I did a lot of supply work, and then had about 6 months of a long-term supply gig at a church called St. Stephen's. They were really trying to help me out, and I was trying to help them out. And after, really evaluating that, there was a point where the coffee shop closed. That was a matter of realizing that without a full-time priest, I mean, maybe a half-time priest could have done it. It's hard to run a business. It's hard to run especially one that just takes so much oversight. We had a beautiful coffee shop manager who relapsed on, I think, cocaine. And that was a good point to say, you know what, like this, it's doing okay financially, but it's not sustainable. It's not, that piece of the model is not sustainable. So we closed the coffee shop and now have volunteers who come in every morning, Monday through Friday, and serve a hot breakfast, and a lay missioner who really coordinates that, and who coordinates a whole lot of the worshiping communities that meet on Wednesday nights and on Sunday afternoons. And because the rent is so high on the building and the electric bill, especially in the summer, is so high, right now that community can't really do much except have a couple of non-stipendiary priests, although we are amazing. So I continue to serve about every other week. And then there's a retired priest who's really awesome, who also serves on a non-stipendiary basis and does not want to be paid. That's just, he doesn't want that. He doesn't want payment to be part of his relationship with that community. And to be honest, like at this point, I don't either. There's a freedom that I've discovered with being, serving a community, about 4 or 5 hours a week, non-stipendiary, and having another job. So the job that I'm in now, that both like gives me life, fills other, church planters with life, but also allows that freedom to be a different kind of priest on the ground. And then as this community at the Abbey moves towards kind of what's up next for them, their lease is ending on this building that they've got in end of June, I believe it is. They're going to have to make a decision because all of a sudden, all this money is going to be freed up, and decide what is the next model that works for them. As far as clergy, are they happy with having priests who are ordained to come in and preach and celebrate the Eucharist, and a lay missioner who really like runs things and leads, or do they want to hire someone who will be more of a paid and ordained person? And just the last thought I would throw out to you that's been really interesting for me. When the coffee shop closed, the Abbey coffee shop closed, I had a big fear that I had failed. Just tremendous fear that this coffee shop was like the marker of success. And one of our community members said to me, Katie, that's ridiculous. She said, failure would have been if the coffee shop kept going and there was no community. Whereas what has happened is the coffee shop has closed and the community's still there. And we have tried across other denominations. I've seen examples of kind of these coffee shop or small business kind of cafe ministries that have not gathered the community together, or have been pure evangelism or pure outreach, but haven't gathered the community together, so that when they did end up closing, the community ended with it. The Abbey, I think, is going to continue. And that was pretty evident by the number of people that have been virtually in church just this past week alone. All right, so I'm going to just kind of stop there. We've got, maybe 10 minutes.
That was beautiful, Katie. Thank you also
Oh,
for that,
thank you.
for that reminder. What is the church?
Yeah.
And if I could just throw out a little vignette, similar and different. So about 6 years ago, or 5.5 years ago, when St. James's money stopped and the diocese hadn't quite kicked in with funding their mission, as I like to say, it's their mission church. There came a point towards the end of the year that I realized I wasn't going to be able to make payroll. And I had a shouting match filled with F-bombs with God. I was really grateful that my husband wasn't home. I live in
I thought you were going to say with my CFO.
No. I was glad that my husband wasn't home, that the neighbor upstairs, I live in a condo, the neighbor upstairs wasn't home. It was about 1 PM. But I was really screaming, rather like if someone had been around to say, call 911. Something is not right in that home. And I was like flat out on the floor, banging on the floor like a little child. It's like, you brought me here. You're the one that said that this is going to have to work, so it's up to you. And at the end of that, my spiritual director said, so you've had your words with God. Now you need to shut up and let God talk to you so that you can hear God. And those were very wise words. I got the strength from where I didn't know I had to tell my bishop, I made her cry, that it might be the time to close down St. Gabriel's. That although as a planter, the last thing I wanted to do was shut this down, but without the support that I needed, financial support, because we had the lay leadership established, we had the ministry established, the children were here, the teens were here, we had the things that you think of church, but we didn't have the money. And I said, well, if there's not financial support for your mission, then I will help you shut it down. I don't know how to do that, but you, Bishop, might be able to help me do that if you've ever done that. But we can do this together. And by the way, if we do it, it has to be pastorally, with a pastor's hand. And you are my pastor, and I come to you for that guidance. And then I, as my spiritual director, timed it. Literally, it was about 8.5 months between my words with God that things started to change. The diocese immediately doubled the amount they were giving from 8. They actually gave us a loan to cover the first, get us through January. And we were getting our first Mission Enterprise Zone grant. So I was going to pay them back that loan with that sort of first $100,000 that back then you got, every, in a quarterly disbursement. So they knew their money was going to come back, but they actually bellied up, stepped up. And in the 8.5 month period, I got a seminarian, a lay worship leader, and a 1.5 years later, I had my first deacon. So God, I needed to have that pregnant time and I'm not a patient person. That's not one of the gifts that God gave me. I'm impatient. I want things tomorrow. And my spiritual director kept me at bay and saying, you need to rest with God and let God do the talking and just shut up and listen. And I did. And things just happened because God is God.
Danielle, it's nice to know that somebody else has almost not made payroll. Yeah.
Very, very scary. I grew up that way. Like we didn't know where the next, paycheck to paycheck. I grew up very poor. As an adult, it was my desire never to be there again. I didn't study engineering because I love technology. I studied engineering because it paid well.
Yeah.
And And so I never thought that I'd be in a church environment suffering the scarcity that I no longer suffered in my professional life.
Yeah.
And it was a humble period in my life and in my ministry. And here we are, you know, we have done so wonderfully well because God is God.
God is God. David, you are virtually raising your hand. David Perkins, are you meaning to?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good.
I just wanted to make a brief comment or two. I was in the Diocese of Virginia, where Danielle is now, doing a parachute drop traditional church plant starting in 2002 in a burgeoning upper middle class neighborhood north of Metro Richmond. There are all sorts of variables, and we've heard some of this from the two of you about around the issue of sustainability. And one of the variables is the model the diocese is following, which you didn't have clarity about. And Danielle went to a church where the model was changing. And my bishop, a much beloved person, said to me about a year before I left, we started you on a model that's not sustainable. They knew it. What they did was give a number of smaller grants to try to start lots of churches rather than focusing a few larger grants. So they handed me $150,000 and said, become self-sustaining in 5 years, in $2,002, which just wasn't doable. But I think that what we discussed in our last Genesis gathering, if you have clarity around the model you're following, that 7 years to 10 years is realistic for a church plant to become sustainable, whether it's a house church model or a traditional model. And then there are all sorts of vicissitudes that happen that may lengthen the timeline. Like in Daniel's case, he came into a church plant that Janae had done a good job starting because we were planning at the same time, but had truncated. My church plant suffered a hit after I left after 8 years because the interim was incompetent. They lost a third of their people and a third of their money in 6 months. So they're just now getting back to being able to talk about building because they had a hiatus of about 5 years where they were trying to recover. The sustainability issue has all sorts of twists and turns to it. One of the most basic things you both highlighted is clarity about expectations with the diocesan leadership. And I was doing a parachute drop, but it was also a convocational plant. So I did get some money from area churches in the first 3 years and some in-kind support. So I think you have to be imaginative and creative and look at a 7 to 10 year timeline and every form of support in kind and financial you can garner to get a freestanding parish. And then once you build and have church debt, you may not be sustainable for a while. You may have to go back on support.
Yeah.
Those are just my observations about it.
I agree with that, David. And as you were talking about really clarifying your model, and I would add to it, communicating with your diocese, particularly if your model is non-traditional, if your model is a cafe or a group of people that hike on Sunday mornings, communicating with them about building in enough support that your model can change and pivot if it needs to. That's another, the Abbey, for example, started out as a cafe, but then came to this point where it actually needs to pivot and is in the midst of pivoting to something probably slightly more traditional. Dave Barnhart, who was on earlier, who does the house churches, he pivoted from a more traditional church plant to house churches. And having some financial space to do that is really important, I think, in the 21st century, because what we expect to work won't necessarily work. Yeah.
And I'd like to add from the Latino ministry perspective, which might be transferable to different settings that you are in. So St. Gabriel's average Sunday attendance now is in the 130 range on a Sunday. And 40% of that number is English speakers and 60% is Spanish speakers. I have had to be in the position of educating our diocesan leaders about the inconsistency in their minds of numbers equals dollars, because the 40% of the people are sustaining 90% of this budget. And they think, and I have something that I keep on throwing at them. So one of the largest Latino ministries in the Episcopal Church is here in Virginia. It is a Spanish-only congregation, La Iglesia Santa Maria. Iglesia Santa Maria has, their ASA now is, I think, between 850 and 900 on a Sunday. They have 3 services. In sort of like an auditorium, school auditorium setting, and they have 3 services. I've been to services where a normal service where I got there late and people are standing outside with speakers. There's speakers, not visual, and they are attending service outside because they don't fit inside, and the Undercroft basement area is full also. So they, despite all the numbers, their stewardship is maybe $130,000 a year, barely able to pay their full-time priest, because when you do all the add-ons and the cost of, in a traditional setting, because that's a Latino ministry, but it's a traditional setting, they have to pay the retirement, they have to pay the health insurance, they have to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. St. Gabriel's has been considered by many people a non-traditional church, and that is so far from the truth. We worship a right to normal English language, BCP, out of the book service in English. Okay, what makes it different maybe is the setting and the music, and normal BCP, Libro de Oración Común, Spanish language service. And what makes it different is one of them is in the morning, the other is in the evening. It's sort of right out of the book, but it's the people that are different. And the fact that we really struggle, and well, struggle is the wrong word, we strive to be one congregation that worships God in 2 languages. Every single person under the earth tries to say your English congregation and your Spanish congregation said, no, we're one congregation. We are San Gabriel, we are St. Gabriel San Gabriel, one congregation that worships God in 2 languages. And even that is a conversation for sustainability, because it's the haves and the have-nots, and let's separate them. No, we are one community. Don't give money for the poor people of San Gabriel. We are one congregation, and one of the challenges that I personally have is my English speakers are the wealthiest in the county and in the community, and my Spanish speakers are cleaning their houses and the poorest in the county. And the balance, the yin and the yang is really, it's kind of screwy. It's hard in my life to have to continue to hold the 2, in place, but here we are.
Good. Well, we're almost at the end of time, but Deb, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. And I guess at this point, based on what was just said, it's to both of you. The history of Emmaus in 5 seconds is that we started out of a home at the request of teenagers. So we were initially youth. We are now not entirely youth. In fact, my adults not far, they outnumber my kids. We're about 60-40. And I'm having an interesting challenge trying to say, sort of along the lines of, no, we're one congregation. I'm sort of having a challenge with, no, we're not a youth church. What we're trying to do in this community is actually a very traditional model in a non-traditional setting. We now rent a space. That's a whole different story. But that transition from the perception of you serve youth to, wow, you have an actual, traditional looking community. My initial question, Katie, was to you, and it may be because you physically yourself personally were transitioning at the same time, but how do you suggest managing that when those kind of transitions need to happen, For instance, we are right now on the border of 3 retirement communities in the Phoenix Valley, the members of which, or citizens of which, are having a really hard time going out and getting groceries and the missing toilet paper and medications. So initially, our bishop called and said, would you guys be willing? You've got younger people who aren't going to be affected as much. Can you help? The answer is absolutely, we can help. But I keep being asked, will your youth come and help? When I need to say, well, my youth is 55, you know, and how do I make that transition gently for the people who are asking those questions? How did you manage a change like that?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, isn't it, as in the case of like the missing toilet paper, right? People panic in the midst of change. You know, I had one woman right after the Abbey coffee shop closed, somebody who worshiped, someone who never even drank coffee at the coffee shop that comes to church on Sunday, say, we don't have a coffee shop anymore. Is the bishop going to come shut us down? And I was like, we're literally the only church in the diocese with a coffee shop, or that ever had one. Like, why would the bishop come shut us down? Yeah, and now, you know, it's at the moment it's, oh no, the lease is ending. You know, does this mean that the church is over? Which is why this moment is so interesting with the coronavirus. You know, does not being able to worship in the same room mean that Christianity is dead? I don't know. I mean, I do know. I know the answer is no, right? But there's people that continue to like kind of freak out like that. I've used a lot of techniques from what's called the art of hosting, which actually we may incorporate some of that into our Genesis training this year, if we're able to have the Genesis training in person. If not, we'll do it online. And those are techniques like affirmative inquiry. You know, what in this community do we really want to lift up? What is the image of beloved community that we want to live into? Questions that are relevant for whatever like your context is. And then, you know, what should be done, and then like what will be done. So much of it is like trying to move people from like the abstract, this is what we could be and this is what we want to be, to, and this is what we will be. I've tried to use some of those with diocesan leadership. That's a little bit harder. When there's, you know, not egos, but kind of professions at stake, and one person is expected to kind of dominate and lead the conversation. Does that get it? I mean, I don't feel like I'm answering your question really, Deb. But there's
No, I think you are. I think what I'm
nudging. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I'm looking for are, they're right in what they're saying. Yes, I have youth in a quantity that most congregations do not. On the other hand, I also have these adults that, quite frankly, we weren't ever sure we could find. And I need to serve them just as, you know, as equally. So it's not that we're not, it's just that initial perception, I feel like the adults are always trying to overcome what a wonderful youth church. We serve a large part of our community is in the LGBT community, or close family members are. So of course we're the gay church. No, what about our straight members? You know, and so it's that sort of perception issue that I'm wondering, when it comes to being seen as sustainable, I'm not serving one population, just like it's not Spanish or English, you know. How do small plants, small missions of whatever sort, who start under one basic premise, what are best practices for saying, oh wait, I think it was actually came out of that Evangelism Matters conference where you presented, and we were talking about mission enterprise zones, and somebody brought up that, you know, we started as a 2-year thing, and now, well, suddenly we have a full parish. And somebody commented back a couple years ago that the mission enterprise zone failed because now it was and I thought, that's a failure. I want to fail like that, you know, desperately. But how do I use that sort of learning that, like, no, I didn't fail to serve kids. I just also serve, you know,
Yeah,
So,
okay.
that's where I'm
Deb,
headed.
Yeah.
How do you communicate that?
Deb,
Yeah,
if I could,
yeah.
if I could just say that,
Okay.
I'm sorry, Katie, but your context and mine are almost identical in identity, because I'm a gay person, so I'm immediately labeled with having a gay church. I'm a Latino person, so I'm immediately labeled with having, oh, it's the Latino church. And I have my response. I'm not diplomatic about it. I'm not gentle about it. I've been quite in people's face that we are a kingdom church. We are a church that resembles the kingdom. I will never, ever be the priest of a gay church. I will never, ever, at this point in my ministry, unless someone says you're going to be the priest of you have to be the priest of a Latino church, but then immediately it won't become that, because we have multiple generations of Latinos. And so that doesn't make any sense. Latino kids don't want to worship in Spanish but they want the music in Spanish. We are a kingdom church. And I have no reparations at going up against any pink shirt and saying, we are not a Latino church, we are not a gay church, and we'll never be. We are an authentically inclusive church where all are authentically welcome. And I get pretty, hairs rise on my neck on this, because people always want to put us into a box, and I'm not gentle about throwing it back, saying, no, don't put me in your box. We're not there. That's not who
That's
we
beautiful.
are.
I want to continue this, but I do want to say, because it's 4:35 Eastern, put this in the chat box, but if you didn't see it, if you need to jump off, please go ahead, and you are not being rude at all. We are so glad that you have been here. Come back next month if you get my emails. We're going to have another couple of these, and one on defining sustainability, but with success, but with diocesan leaders in particular, but you're welcome to jump in on that. And then another that's about pivoting, which is something that we came up with. So those will both be in April over Zoom. But if folks want to stay on this call and just kind of continue to share some stories, you're also welcome to do that. But if you can't, you can jump off now.
I wanted to make a comment for Emmaus Episcopal. I've forgotten your first name. I'm sorry.
It's Debbie.
Debbie, before you go, you're talking about having made a pivot, and the community, some of the people in the community haven't caught up with that. Some of that you will never overcome, obviously. But it also gives you an opportunity for engagement with people who vocalize the misperception. So you get the chance for dialogue and corrective dialogue. The other thing I think you can do is to be intentional about planning public events where you can expose yourself more fully as an intergenerational church. Taste and see events, things that reveal who you are. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years for community perception to flip, but you can have a hand in that. That was all I wanted to say.
No, I appreciate it. That timeline is actually encouraging.
The Abbey is overcoming right now this perception that it's full of homeless and disabled people, which is, shouldn't be a criticism, right? But at the same time, there's really strong neurotypical leaders as well, and people who are housed and are and because it's seen as a place where there's a lot of folks on the autism spectrum or disabled or homeless, that it's the community is not sustainable, and there's people who think it should not exist because of that. I mean, I got that a couple of weeks ago. And it takes a long time, whoever just said that, right, to start to move the outside mindset. Bishops can help with that too. And I wish they would more often, using whatever kinds of means of communicating with clergy and with lay people and diocesan newsletters. When a bishop says something, people take it as true. And that's something to also be communicating with your diocesan leadership about, what is it that you need from them? What is it that you need them to communicate for you? What else? Nelson or Peggy or Teresa, this conversation like raising anything for you?
Well, I appreciate I appreciate the sharing that's been how you blame yourself, or how easy it is to fall into traps of being sucked into the politics. So at least I know we're not alone in that.
Mm-hmm.
And the grant writing is very helpful. So thanks for those tips. It's been helpful. Thank you.
Good.
I just want to say thank you because you gave me a lot of ideas, and as I texted a few minutes ago, you encouraged me to develop a ministry in the church in the way that we are doing, putting our focus in the people and their needs, and thinking that we are no longer, like Daniel said a few minutes ago, not we are not ministries for gay people, Latino people, but we are ministries in the Church of God, and we have to work for all the people.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm sure I'm not in a missionary, but I have to work for all the church.
Yeah. Thank you, Nelson.
Nelson, that's the only way to be sustainable.
Yeah.
As I said, you could have 10 churches of 1,000 people, and they won't be sustainable unless the kingdom, the rest of the churches, are behind all of the churches to help them. I had an experience. I've requested several bishops to jump into this model of financial sustainability to stretch out the sort of dollars over longer periods of time, where I've requested that they go to the financially stable churches in the diocese, the rich churches in the diocese, and get a group of 3, 4, or 5 that have a mission outlook, that want to support a new mission church, and stagger gifts. So maybe one church could give $10,000 for 3 years, another can give 20, another can give 5, another can give 2. Stagger it so that the mission church can receive funding over a wider chunk of time, and just, it's not sustainable, but they contribute. They are part of your mission. And bishops haven't bought into that. And I'm kind of surprised. I think that there are churches out there with deep pockets that don't need it for their roofs because they've already fixed it, and might be interested if they have a bishop or the clergy coming to them to sort of sell the point. And bishops have told me to stop, that shouldn't be something I do on my own. It should come from them, but then they don't go ahead and do it. But I do think that there are enough churches in some dioceses that are, what do they call it? The rich churches are called the endowed parishes. That, all you need is 1 or 2, and they can help sustain the budget of the new church. They were a new church once, and we have to sort of remind them that they were, and maybe help our bishops see that it's one way of being missional, even if your mission is that mission to support a new church plant, a new mission church, but somehow it's not something that people jump onto, and they have their reasons, and I've been told what the reasons are. I still don't believe that it should be that way.
Thank you.
Y'all, this is a tough topic. And like, we were saying at the beginning, I think that this virus outbreak is really going to, well, my hope is that it's going to help us redefine what sustainability really is beyond this. Yeah, do you have the endowment, right? But is your community strong, and is it resilient, and is it being faithful? And yeah, like that's my hope, is that there's a little bit of a reckoning with some of the more worldly ways that we've defined success and sustainability in the past.
And I think the people that are clamoring for community in this time of sort of, I don't call it social distancing, because this is social being together, but in our physical distancing, the people that are really clamoring to have a face contact with a Zoom service or whatever, that's the core of people that you know are the ones that will are the sustainability in people in your parish. It doesn't mean that the others aren't, or that the others don't. It's not as important to them. It's just different. But the people who can't live through the week without having some communal God time, those are the people. Those are your anchor people, and those are your sustainability people. Again, defining it without money. I'm defining it as individuals.
Yes.
Yo, we're praying for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I am. So Danielle is, the task force is. And please continue letting us know. Deb, do you get my emails?
Occasionally, I must be on some list, but not another.
Yeah. Like, did you get an email reminder of this call?
No, I didn't. I don't think so.
See
Did you
you
send one
later.
like
I have a
yesterday or
meeting.
today?
See you soon.
Hi, Nelson.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks, Nelson.
Katie, I need to get off, and crew. Teresa, it's good to see you. And Debbie, it's really nice to meet you, and I'd like us to have conversations. So I put my email on that list, and I'd like to pick your brain, and maybe you'd like to pick mine.
I would love to. And this is
I'll
mine,
see
and I
your
will.
email here.
Yeah, I'll send you one too. Thank you. And Teresa, nice to see you again.
Thank you. Same bit. Wow, we were part of the Fringes, right?
I know, right? What happened?
Yeah.
We all went by the Fringe,
The Fringes. That's right, because we were.
but we all
serving-
fell apart.
Yeah, but you're still there. Wonderful.
I
Good
am.
to
It's
see
nice
you.
to see you too.
Thank
So
you.
Deb, it is Emmaus Episcopal, not Deb
Yes.
Tickle, right? Emmaus Episcopal.
My name is Deb Tickle. If I
Right.
dial in from my phone, I show up that way. Emmaus Episcopal
Right.
Church, and we're in Surprise, Arizona. Yeah.
Cool. All right, everyone. God bless you. I'll sign off for now.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.